Welcome to tonight's London Luminaries lecture series, 12 historic organisations working together collaboratively to celebrate our local history. My name is Rachel Morrison and I'm from Marble Hill and I'll be the host for this talk today. So it's with great delight that I get the opportunity to welcome our chair for this evening. She's a professor of literature, a trustee of Pope's Grotto Preservation Trust and an eminent broadcaster. It's Professor Judith Hawley.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you to our audience who are watching us live. From many of you from different parts of the world, it's great to welcome you to Twickenham, to Strawberry Hill in particular, and welcome to those of you who are watching us later on YouTube. Thank you also to the many volunteers who have helped us with this particular series of Luminaries lectures, and to the many volunteers who keep our lovely historic properties going. This series of lectures, each one works on its own, but as a series, it together draws out many of the connections and unknown stories about houses which may well be familiar to you. And tonight's story is going to be about Strawberry Hill House, the home of Horace Walpole. And our speaker tonight is Dr. Martin Postle, who tells me that he first visited Strawberry Hill in 1975, though he barely looks old enough to have been able to do so. He's currently a senior research fellow at the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art. He also serves as a trustee of Strawberry Hill House Trust and of the Walpole Society. He is currently writing a catalogue raisonné of the oil paintings of Joseph Wright of Derby. And his subject tonight is Patron and Painter, Horace Walpole and John Giles Eccardt. Over to you, Martin.
Well, thank you very much, Judith, and thank you very much, Rachel, and good evening, everyone, wherever you might be and whatever time zone you're occupying at the moment on this planet. Well, Horace Walpole needs little introduction, I think. The youngest son of Sir Robert Walpole, de facto first British Prime Minister, first Earl of Orford. Horace himself eventually succeeded to the earldom, and he was the fourth and last Earl of Orford. Titled, entitled, amusing, amused, gossipy, mildly eccentric, and above all, inquisitive and acquisitive, Horace Walpole was a man of many parts. He's, of course, synonymous with Strawberry Hill. We can see him here in his own portrait by Eckardt, with Strawberry Hill in the background, and then Strawberry Hill as it is today. So Strawberry Hill was the Gothic castle. Many of you are familiar with it personally, that Horace began constructing in 1749, and which was to preoccupy him for the next 40 years or so. My talk, however, is not about Strawberry Hill, except as a crucible for Walpole's patronage of one particular artist. We could have looked at many, but we're looking at one artist, John Giles Eccardt. My talk falls into two rather unequal halves. In the first part, I'm going to discuss the portraits that Eckardt painted for Walpole at Strawberry Hill. Then I'm going to go on to focus on Eckardt himself, who, unlike his pecunious patron, remains to many people a rather elusive and shadowy figure. Horace Walpole was painted by many artists from his boyhood right throughout his life. And Eckardt's portrait isn't the best, I think, in terms of quality, but it became a defining image, and one that Horace Walpole himself was particularly fond of. And even many years later, in 1842, it was used as the frontispiece, the extraordinary sale catalogue that accompanied the 24-day sale of his collection. And I'm showing you here the frontispiece, as you can see. So, without further ado, let's go to Strawberry Hill and find out more about this intriguing patron and this very intriguing painter. These two floor plans show the house as it was virtually complete in the early 1780s. We're going to ascend the Gothic staircase, and we're going to enter one of the smaller rooms, which constituted, in a sense, a kind of inner sanctum at the heart of Horace's and John Giles Eccardt's enterprise. So we're now in the blue bed chamber, and it was in this room hung 7 portraits of Horace Walpole, his close friends, and his immediate family. And this is how it looked quite recently in 2018, when some of these works returned memorably for the Lost Treasures exhibition, which again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Horace described the picture hang to his friend Richard Bentley in a letter of 18th of May, 1754. He says, "In each panel round the room is a single picture, Gray's, Sir Charles Williams's, and yours, in their black and gold frames. Mine is to match yours." The custom frames were very carefully constructed and based upon trompe-l'oeil frames placed around prints after Van Dyck by a London-based French engraver, Pierre Lombard. It's appropriate, I think, that Eckardt's small-scale portraits, they measure only about 15 by 12 inches. It's significant that they are really on the scale of prints. Sadly, most of the portraits have lost their original frames. So I've taken the liberty of reinserting them into more or less original frames on a blue wall, all courtesy of Microsoft. It is useful occasionally. Walpole is depicted in a so-called Van Dyck costume, proudly holding in his hand a copy of the Aedes Walpoleanae, a description of the collection of pictures at Houghton Hall, the seat of the Right Honourable Sir Robert Walpole, Earl of Orford, and this he's holding the 2nd edition of 1752. Even given Horace's advantages in life and his ready access to a world-class art collection, the book was a considerable achievement for a young man in his later 20s when he first completed it. Bentley, Richard Bentley, was a writer, a designer, and a member of Walpole's Strawberry Hill Committee. He holds, and I'm quoting from Walpole, he holds in one hand his own design of the figure of Melancholy, drawn by him for the edition of Mr. Gray's Odes. And that's from Walpole's description of Strawberry Hill, which he published, the 2nd description he published in 1784. Okay, so the other 2 single portraits in the room are Thomas Gray, best known member today of Horace Walpole's intimate circle. Gray was a distinguished classical scholar in his own right. He was a poet, and he was, of course, the author of the celebrated Elegy in a Country Churchyard. He'd been a friend of Horace's at school. They were at Eton together, and the 2 young men had recently undertaken a grand tour together. They travelled across the continent together quite memorably. And Gray holds in his hand his Ode on a Distant Prospect of Eton College. Also here we've got Sir Charles Hanbury Williams, rather less known these days. He was sometime diplomat, he was a poet, he was a satirizer, apparently very, very amusing conversationalist in many ways, rather irreverent. He holds a copy of a satirical poem, Isabella or the Morning, and you can just about make out the writing on the sheet that he's holding. These were verses ostensibly on the Duchess of Manchester, but as I say, they're very satirical in intent. So as a group, these 4 pictures reflect a private world of progressive aesthetics, homosocial bonding, as well as a tacit political affiliation to the Whig Party ideals upheld by Sir Robert Walpole and his cronies. Then in the room, we've got 2 group family portraits. We've got Henry Seymour Conway and his family on the left, and Lady Maria Walpole with her husband Charles Churchill and their eldest son Charles. The Conway portrait, which I think is actually perhaps less successful in certain ways, is derived from a composition by the French painter Antoine Watteau. And Conway owned, dare I say, a not very good copy of it, which is now in the Wallace collection. The other portrait, which is I think more successful, is based upon a celebrated portrait by Rubens. Rubens in an idealized garden in his house in Antwerp with his young wife, and son. And here you can see quite clearly the comparison between the two. The original painting by Rubens was then owned by the Duke of Marlborough and was at Blenheim. Walpole would have been familiar with it, although Eckardt himself probably relied upon a miniature copy by an artist called Bernard Lenz, a version of which Walpole commissioned to hang in the room called the Tribune at Strawberry Hill. Now, the role played by the copy is crucial to the understanding of Walpole pictures, both literally, because they are copies, and theoretically, as we can see. So, as we can see, Walpole's portrait is modelled upon a print of Simon Vouet, who was a painter, an etcher, an academician, and like Walpole, he's holding a book. He was the premier peintre du roi to Louis XIII. Bentley is based upon an image of the Flemish painter Adam de Costa, also after Van Dyck, and the other two portraits of Henry Williams and Gray are also based on Old Master prints. So the Old Master prints are after paintings by Van Dyck, and they're from a series, a very celebrated series called the Iconography. Likenesses of some of the most famous crowned heads, military men, scholars, artists of the time. So dating from the later 1620s, whereas these, of course, are young men in their 30s, so there's a kind of satirical is probably the wrong word, but this playful kind of comparison between themselves and these rather important 17th century public figures. So it's very witty. It's a witty kind of riposte in a way. So this fascination with copying is not remotely unique to Walpole, of course, and we saw that last week in Tessa Kilgareth's excellent account of Henrietta Howard at Marble Hill. The copy was a deeply respected art form, not only in pedagogy, but as a cornerstone of the concept of imitation in Augustan high culture, consciously imitating great classical art and literature of the past, exploring and reinvigorating history and its relevance to contemporary Britain. So it's a sort of massive trope in a sense that Walpole's playing into. In art, for example, the copy played a key role in shaping the art of Joshua Reynolds, who was at that time also building his career in the metropolis, and who counted among his own patrons Horace Walpole. Well, time's moving on for us swiftly, and we only have time to mention just a few of the other pictures, and there are about 25, 26 in all, by Eckardt, which were painted for Walpole at Strawberry Hill. So let's leave the blue bedchamber, we'll be coming back there, and move on to the Great North Chamber, which is also situated on the principal floor. And here we find, and it's still there today, albeit on loan, a copy after Sir Peter Lely's portrait of Elizabeth Hamilton. And I'm showing you a detail of the Lely here, just for the sake of the comparison. She was the wife of the French Count Philibert de Gramont, who was exiled from the French court for chatting up the king's mistress and lots of other things. Extraordinary character. She was one of Lely's celebrated Windsor beauties, known as, sounds rather incongruous, La Belle Hamilton, or Hamilton. And both she and her husband were of particular interest to Walpole, a bit of an obsession. And in the early 1750s, he was beginning to consider publishing an edition of the Count's memoirs, as well as collecting art and objects associated with them. So Walpole typically physically draws into the environment of Strawberry Hill physical objects that have a kind of talismanic quality, you know, the touch, the feel, the look. It's history. He wasn't a great bibliophile or a book collector. He did it visually through images. He was a curator, and I think that's my talking personally as an ex-museum curator, find that aspect actually fascinating. So let's regretfully, having looked at that, we're going to hurry on. We're going to run downstairs or hop downstairs to the Great Parlour. And here, I'm showing here a depiction of the Great Parlour by an artist called John Carter. Carter was a draftsman, an architect, an advocate of the Gothic, another one of those figures who are in Horace's orbit in Strawberry Hill, because Eckardt, of course, wasn't unusual or unique in that respect. He was just one of many people who was sort of servicing Horace's interests. This shows the room as it looked in the 1780s. It's not too different in essence to how it looks today, some 240 years later, and there it is. That's how pretty much it looks at the moment. Now, quite a few objects from the room have admittedly moved on. Reynolds's Wargrave Sisters of 1780 is represented now by a manufactured simile on the wall, very convincing simile, it has to be said, and I have to look very closely to see that it's not actually a real oil painting. And it's now the originals in the National Galleries of Scotland. Another picture to have departed, which is rather less well known, is this picture. So it's by Eckardt, and it dates from 1752, and it's of Lady Maria Walpole, who was the only child of Sir Robert and his mistress, Maria Skerritt, and she was the wife of Charles Churchill, we saw before. And here she's wearing a veil, she's got a music book before her. This picture is now in the collection of the Lewis Walpole Library at Yale University, where so many of Walpole's treasures now reside. Now, one thing to note, and one wouldn't know that just from looking at this slide, is that it's painted on a conventional 30 by 25 inch canvas. So 30 inches by 25. That's the standard for this type of portrait. And it reminds us, I think this is quite an important point that came to me while I was preparing this lecture. Eckardt was not per se a painter of small portraits, as he's often described, but that the format was dictated specifically by Walpole as a patron for the specific display requirements at Strawberry Hill. In fact, as we'll go on to see, he had painted on a hugely different scale for other people. One work of art involving Eckardt, which left Strawberry Hill, but which was returned comparatively recently, about 12 years ago, is a portrait of George Walpole, the third Earl of Alford, Walpole's nephew, and it's inset, that you can see it's inset into a mirror. And this is a joint effort between Horace as designer, a chap called William Hallett, who was a cabinet and furniture maker, and Eckardt himself. And it was made around about 1754 to 55. And to me, it encapsulates in an exemplary manner the unique spirit of Strawberry Hill, while sort of almost quite literally reflecting the past. And I love this slide. I didn't take this, but this was taken when during the Lost Treasure exhibition, when so many of these pictures that had belonged to Walpole came back to the house. So what you're looking at is as close as you're going to get to looking at what Walpole was seeing in that mirror in many ways. Now, Eckardt's portrait is a copy, and this time it's a copy from a miniature belonging to Walpole, made by a Swiss contemporary artist called Jean-Étienne Lyotard, very fashionable at that time, came to England and made lots of money. And the miniature itself was housed in Walpole's beautiful rosewood cabinet in the Tribune. The cabinet's now in the Victoria and Albert Museum. And you can see it here. You see my little arrow there that's running around. You can see it if you follow my arrow down, and I think I've got this right. I was just looking at the other day. That, I would assume, is the miniature by Lyotard in the cabinet itself. Okay. So for the remainder of this talk, I'd like to shift the focus towards Eckardt himself. Who was he, and how did he become to work or be employed by Horace Walpole? So to do so, let's return briefly to the blue bedchamber, although sadly it was beyond my skills to put this on a blue wall. This is another portrait involving Eckardt, and this is the one featuring Horace Walpole's parents, Sir Robert Walpole and Catherine Shorter. It's another relatively small scale confection, and I think it's fair to say, and many of you will know it, the original is actually at the Lewis Walpole Library in Yale University, and there's a facsimile at Strawberry Hill. And it's rather overwhelmed by the carved gilt frame, which Walpole was very fond of because he considered it to be by Grinling Gibbons. But our focus is on the picture itself, the painting itself. So, as I say, partly the work of Eckardt, he did the figures, and an artist called John Wooten, who was a sporting artist, did the dogs and probably the background and the landscape and Houghton Hall itself. So I'm going to show you a nice detail here. And here you can see Sir Robert seated by the Lord Chancellor's burse. That's that object on the table, sort of symbolic of his role as in charge of the exchequer. And it's decorated with his coat of arms and the busts of the two monarchs he served, George I and George II. Well, Sir Robert had died in 1745, and it's surely no coincidence that a year later, Horace Walpole began to employ Eckardt, who up to that point had been working as a studio assistant to the French painter Jean-Baptiste Van Loo, whose most prestigious portrait client was, of course, Sir Robert Walpole. Now here, moving on, is Walpole portrayed by Van Loo as First Commissioner or Lord of the Treasury, Chancellor of the Exchequer, the officers that gave him significant control over government spending and, of course, allowed him to siphon off quite a lot of money for himself. Walpole wears a brocaded coat. He's got a long wig and a sash and is hung with a garter emblem. And his right hand, again, he's holding the burse, which is decorated with the coat of arms, which features in Eckardt's painting. So the full length is now in St. Petersburg. It was sold off by Horace's nephew, who we've just seen in 1779, and like a lot of other treasures from Houghton Hall, it went to St. Petersburg. This is a copy in the Portrait Gallery in London, studio of Van Loo. There are quite a few of them, and in there somewhere, almost certainly, is John Giles Eccardt. You know, we don't know which bits he painted exactly, but he's almost certainly there as a sort of playing a supporting role, but a very important supporting role in that picture. So let's move on again. And I want to now turn to Eckardt's career in some detail, a little bit of detail, as far as we're able to do so. So I'm going to sort of move away from images of pictures to documents for a little bit. We know that Eckardt only ever exhibited 2 works of art at exhibition: a self-portrait from 1761, and you can see it there if you look at the right, second one down, number 29, his own portrait, Mr Eckardt. He also exhibited at the Society of Artists in 1768 a portrait of a lady. Both pictures remain untraced, and we don't know who the lady in question was. Indeed, there's no known image of Eckardt himself. We don't know what he looked like. So in order to obtain a picture of his world beyond Strawberry Hill, we have to rely on scraps, official documents, birth, death, marriage certificates, manuscript notes, as well as the relatively few other known portraits not commissioned by his principal patron, Horace Walpole. So John Giles Eckardt was born, and his name when he was born was Johannes Egidius Eckardt, and he was born on the 25th of June, 1711 in Darmstadt, Hesse, Germany. And he was the 4th of 6 children of Johann Wendel Eckardt, a sculptor, son of a sculptor, and his wife, Anna Elizabeth Jauch. And by the late 1730s, he'd moved to England, possibly Van Loo. And if you want to get a good parallel comparison with that movement, an artist better known than Eckardt, who has a similar trajectory, is Johann Zoffany. Slightly later generation, but very, very similar kind of trajectory in certain ways. So by the 1730s, he moves to England, possibly moves with Van Loo, we don't know. The story is taken up by a painter and engraver called George Vertue, whom Walpole knew very well in later life, and whose, in Vertue's later life, and whose notes and jottings on the British art scene have proved so invaluable. In fact, so invaluable that Walpole acquired them from Vertue's widow after his death, and they formed the basis of his own book, his own anecdotes on English painting. So having ran a flourishing portrait business in London, Van Loo left England abruptly. He was in very poor health, apparently. He left in 1742. Vertue notes, and I'm quoting now, he had 2 painters that assisted him in his business, copying and draperies. They continued here, and having much his same manner of painting, have got a good business. The one whose name is Eckardt, remember these are notes, the one whose name is Eckardt, a good painter, who paints the portraits. The other assists him in painting the draperies. Horace Walpole later himself identified the other man, the other assistant, simply as Root. Well, although his identity remains generally unknown today, and he's still referred to as Root, he was, in fact, George Roth. George Roth, he was also German-born. And I'd come across Roth before. I hadn't known about this until relatively recently. But Roth, I knew because he worked as a drapery painter for Joshua Reynolds, and amongst others, but that's another story. Eckardt is mentioned in Walpole's own correspondence for the first time in April 1746. A few months later, in July, he even dedicated an epistle to Eckardt the Painter, and it was entitled The Beauties. Walpole got a bit miffed because it got published really without his permission. But at that time, Walpole, who was probably a better letter writer than he was a poet, let's be honest, he had high hopes for Eckardt to be a kind of successor to Sir Godfrey Kneller. And from that time, Eckardt's name crops up again occasionally in Walpole's letters, but only in reference to specific commissions. We do know, however, that around the time his employment with Walpole, Horace Walpole, began, Eckardt moved from Bow Street to nearby Covent Garden. And interestingly, he took up apartments formerly occupied by Van Loo, so he must have been doing okay. By this time, Eckardt had painted the portraits of these two celebrated actresses, Susanna Cibber and Peg Woffington, both pictures probably commissioned by a chap called Grosvenor Bedford. Now, Grosvenor Bedford was Horace Walpole's friend. He'd worked closely as a political ally or placeman of Sir Robert Walpole. Now, although we don't know, there might be more like this by Eckardt, still awaiting discovery. And interestingly, the Cibber portrait, just briefly in passing, was only actually identified a few years ago. It popped up 3 times in London auction house, and then eventually, the 3rd time, it was snapped up by an eagle-eyed Yale professor who, recognizing the sitter, not necessarily recognizing Eckardt, he shrewdly snapped it up, and it now resides at Yale University in a club called the Elizabethan Club. Well, returning to Eckardt himself, we do know something about his personal life beyond Strawberry Hill. In July 1746, only months after gaining employment from Horace Walpole, he got married. His wife, Susanna, was the daughter of a well-to-do watchmaker called Jacob Duhamel. Duhamel was a member of a dynasty of renowned watchmakers. They were very successful. And this marriage, as it's been observed, might have secured his financial, probably did secure his financial security. He also, while in the employ of Walpole, had 2 children, Jacob or Jacob, who was born in 1748, and Susanna. And here I unearthed the baptismal certificate the other day of Jacob, son of John Giles Eckardt, and where is it? He's somewhere. Jacob, son of Giles Eckardt, by Susanna, his wife, 28th of July. Also, I came across this, which is interesting. It's the indenture of Jacob, 1764, to a chap called Daniel Hancock, who was a baker. And these documents are sometimes all we've got to go with, but they're very useful. So we also know that Jacob, lucky old or young Jacob Eckardt, was willed by his father £2,000 in his will, a lot of money. And he also left him the lease on a house in Covent Garden. So he became a wealthy man in his own right. For further personal background, we can look to a manuscript. This is Walpole's manuscript, Book of Materials, in which he recorded the various details of the various other things that interested him. Well, in this Book of Materials, it's at Yale University now, and luckily the stuff is online, so I trawled through it a little bit. In 1761, he recorded among the principal painters, now that's interesting, the principal painters now in London, Eckardt was living in Newport Street in the house that was Reynolds. That's interesting, because Joshua Reynolds in 1760 moved to Leicester Square or Leicester Fields. And according to Walpole, and I haven't checked the housing records, but worth looking at. Eckardt moved in there, and he was a principal, so he was important in his own right. However, 2 years later, in 1763, Walpole records on a more somber note that this year, if you look at the inscription there, and I've put a transcription because it's a little bit difficult to read. It says, this year, where am I? This year, Mr Eckardt the painter, whose business had declined by the success of Reynolds and Ramsay, assisted the latter in copying his portraits of the King and Queen, the latter of which was just finished. And then he goes on to say that Ramsay was a frequent speaker at the Society of Arts and Sciences, etc., etc. That's kind of telling, and there's a lot. That's quite loaded and very interesting, because what Ramsay was doing, okay, so he declined in one sense, but what he was doing was this. And this isn't something I think is really widely known. Walpole no longer required his services, and he was forced to fall back on his abilities as a drapery painter, joining this what we call a portrait factory run by Alan Ramsay at his London house, producing version after version of his official coronation portraits. And here he renewed his working partnership with George Roth, who then worked for both Reynolds and Ramsay. So we needn't be too sorry for Eckardt, because the demand for the versions of these official state portraits was immense, from members of the royal family, heads of state, colonial governors, ambassadors, corporations, institutions, and courtiers. Copy. There were orders, for example, for 150 pairs, 26 of George alone, 9 of the Queen alone. So 150 pairs of these portraits that we're looking at. 26 of George III, 9 of the Queen alone. And it was lucrative employment. David Martin, one of his fellow assistants with Ramsay, is recorded in 1766 to 67 as receiving over £300 that year. That's a very decent income. So at the end of his career, Eckardt then returned to his roots, no pun intended, although the irony would not have escaped him that while his former patrons, Sir Robert Walpole and his son Horace, had been die-hard advocates of the Whig cause, his later patron, George III, and his principal portrait painter, Alan Ramsay, had nailed their colours firmly to the Tory mast. So Eckardt then, in his late 50s, retired. He retired in 1770. He sold his art collection at auction. He sold some pieces to Walpole, and he retired to the aptly named Paradise Row in Chelsea, where he died in October 1779. Did he, I wonder, before he died, venture the few miles upstream to Twickenham and revisit his old haunt at Strawberry Hill? We don't know, but it's a nice thought on which to end. Thank you. Before we start some Q&A, I do want to mention, and this is something that we've had in previous lectures, the very important role that volunteers play in the houses that we're talking about. And Strawberry Hill, no less than any other. It's a fantastic place to be a volunteer. There's so much variety, the cornucopia, so many different objects to learn about in terms of the collection itself. So as it says on the screen here, visit the website if you want more information on how you can get involved. So I think that's Judith, over to you.
Thank you so much, Martin, people always say, for that fascinating talk, but it really was. I think you gave us an amazing insight into the worlds of Horace Walpole and his committee of taste, his associates, but also into the life of a jobbing artist, of a professional artist. Can I, before we open for Q&A, draw your attention to the rest of the talks in this series? We have more artists. We have Hogarth and Turner, and we also have another amazing site, Boston Manor House. And information about the whole of the series can be found on the London Luminaries website, and all of the previous talks are or will be available on our YouTube channel.